Okay, everyone, this is the third attempt at this video. The first one just didn't upload and didn't process, and the second one, I don't have a makeup artist or any sense of the lighting until the video is actually done. So the board really didn't have the right lighting in my office. So I'm at my house and I've got the blinds pulled and I've got different lighting. So I think there's no reflection on this board. So you can see clearly what's on the board because these are the points that I want to talk about today. And I think I'll be more efficient. The first video was 40 minutes. The second one was 30. So I'm just going to tell you what you need to know for the quiz on Friday. And then we'll call it a day. I was outside all day because it's a holiday. And I came home to discover that things were not finished properly. So I apologize for not having this video out earlier this week. But now, hopefully, this will be the last attempt. And this will be the best version. So at least there's that, right? So week 5, there was no video. We'll make that one up later. We're going to close out the Middle Ages and start talking about something more familiar to all of you soon. The Chosun period kind of overlaps in the Middle Ages with the European, stages, but we'll talk about that later. And I'll talk about this at the end of the class. The most important thing that you need to know right now is that the two people that you need to know about, Geoffrey Chaucer and John Wycliffe. Chaucer, I believe, was born actually in 1348. We don't know his exact birthday, I think. But he was born right as the Black Death arrived in England. So he's a good, he's an exceptional writer for his day and age. And he's sort of, I guess, I'm not sure who you would compare him with. Even in France, I'm not sure who would, sort of measure up against Chaucer, or in Korea. Sejong comes along after Chaucer's, almost dead. So the Italian Renaissance is really the only sort of group of people that are contemporary to Chaucer that I can compare him to. Certainly there was people in Islamic countries who were very accomplished writers before Chaucer, but I don't know them very well, so I'm not going to talk about them. But there are medieval writers that predate Chaucer who are fantastic. But for English, Chaucer is the sort of father of the English language. I often say to my students that Shakespeare is who I know the best and who I have studied for, almost 25 years. So Shakespeare is the master of English, you might say. And but the person who got things going, the person who Shakespeare read in order to be inspired to write his amazing poetry and plays, is Chaucer, okay? So he was born, and luckily he didn't die, because especially there was, if you were a baby, there was a good chance that you would not survive if you were a baby. And then during the Black Death, it would be very easy for your family to be infected, and for the baby, not to be taken care of, or for the baby to die, because, the immune system is developing when you're young. So the Black Death came along, wiped out definitely half of the children who were young, like 5 years or younger. There was probably a good chance that you wouldn't survive to adulthood anyway. The average lifespan is like 35 years or 40 years. During the Black Death, it's down, to people in their 20s or, in their teens not surviving. So Chaucer is he miraculously survives, and John Wycliffe is in the same generation. So, as I told you in class, there's diaries of people writing saying, if anybody's alive still to read this, then I want you to know this is what it was like. Chaucer and Wycliffe survived, and they knew, like, they grew up with all of this happening, so they knew that society and civilization hadn't completely been destroyed, just partially. I guess I didn't say this in class, but probably the only thing that would be the same for us would be like if we had a nuclear, like if World War III broke out, and this is a real possibility, so we should be serious about this, that nuclear weapons were used and 30% of the population of the world, was suddenly gone. I think that's the only thing that would be the same. A nuclear apocalypse would be the same sort of thing. So after that, you imagine after that happened, like I said, the Black Death had lots of negative effects. Obviously, those are the obvious ones, but there were some positive outcomes. I guess some of those outcomes were Dante Alighieri, who suffered and died while he was writing the Divine Comedies in Italy. Boccaccio and Petrarch. That's kind of the three guys who are the greatest Italian writers, and they write in Italian, and they write poetry, and they write just amazing. They're just literary geniuses, and they just write things that are different than anybody who's written before. And Chaucer does that for us in English. He writes about individuals who are on a pilgrimage to, remember, Thomas Becket. Don't forget about Thomas Becket and Henry II, because that's not in the textbook. But Thomas Becket was killed in Canterbury Cathedral, and then he was made a saint very quickly. And so that was the holiest place you could visit in England. Otherwise, you go to Spain, or you go to Rome, or if you were really adventurous, you would go to Jerusalem, which maybe in Korean you would probably say Jerusalem or something like that. something more similar to how you would say it in Hebrew or in Greek or in Jewish languages, right? So Jerusalem would be the ideal place to go. But if you were going to visit somewhere in England, that's where you would go, Canterbury. And that's where the Archbishop also lived. So Chaucer talks about a group of people going to Canterbury, and there's different types of people, priests, and there's a woman called the Wife of Bath who's very unique. She's been married like 4 times, and so she's got lots of experience about marriage, and she talks about that. The priests talk about being priests, and they generally, he doesn't have a lot of positive things to say about the priests or other clerical people. The Parson's Tale, it's also like, there's several religious figures in the tales. I will give you a sample of this after the quiz, but basically, the point of view we get is that the church, like I said, people are starting to question the church's role in society, and Chaucer does a very good job of that. Other than that, he establishes a sort of standard in English. There's no dictionary. There's no standard English. Doesn't exist. The Queen's English or BBC English or CNN English or international, there's no such thing as this stuff. Everybody speaks English differently. Nobody knows how it's supposed to be written, but Chaucer sort of creates this language from gathering together the dialects of the West Midlands, which is sort of the middle part of southwestern England, and gathering those dialects together, he just sort of writes down what he thinks is the way it should be written. And that establishes the sort of precedent for Shakespeare to turn English into what it is now. Not just Shakespeare. There's a whole generation of people. It takes several hundred years for English to become what it is. But we talked about French. We talked about Vikings giving words to English, and Latin giving words to English, and Greek English was a Germanic language. Its foundation is Germanic, but it sort of became a gigantic language with a big vocabulary through adding other languages. Okay, so, and Chaucer is a big part of that. He was very, I guess he was well educated, so his Latin and French was very good. So, you know, in his writing, he kind of makes fun of people who don't speak French well, which I always thought that's not very nice of him, because my French isn't fantastic, but I do my best. Quebecois is kind of French, but Chaucer would probably look down his nose at me. Anyway, so Chaucer comes at us from this 14th century sort of these terrible events that affect society, but he turns it into something, in a way, something positive that you can learn from, and that develops the culture a lot. Wycliffe does the same thing. He's a kind of revolutionary. He believes that religion needs to be reformed. He's like a pre-Luther figure, and he gets the support of some wealthy barons, and he's able through them to sort of, he's an Oxford priest, like he's well educated. There's a lot of very similar things between him and Martin Luther, the German priest who starts the Reformation. But John Wycliffe is 150 years before him, and the revolution doesn't happen. I told you, it's basically, British culture is basically conservative, and the king and his close advisors didn't really like these ideas. Like, John Wycliffe wanted the Bible to be written in English and be accessible to everyone. The Catholic Church didn't like that. The king didn't like that. He didn't want a lot of peasants, running around. That's part of what the Peasants' Revolt is about, right? Remember, 1381 is that, point of explosion where there's too much death and taxes, and there's, the religion is not really compensating for the amount of suffering and the amount of, pressure on the people, as it usually does. It usually does do that, but in this case, they get pushed too far, and but they still, that's what the upper class, which is a small number of people, they really want to control the population. This is true in almost every society. We like popular government in a lot of developed countries, but at the same time, you really don't want uneducated people or like a gigantic mob of people with sticks and stones running around destroying everything, which is sort of what John Wycliffe inspired partly. So in the end, he sort of retires. He's protected by the wealthy people, but his two ideas that are the most controversial are, he wants everybody to have access to the Bible in vernacular language, in English, and he wants to dissolve the church property. And this is going to happen. Henry VIII is going to come along 150 years later, and he's going to do exactly what John Wycliffe suggested. And it's not helpful, as it turns out. But what John Wycliffe wanted was all the expensive land and the possessions of the church to be given to the people, spread out amongst the people. It's really like a New Testament sort of Christian fundamental idea that, blessed be the poor, and it's almost kind of communist if you guys can accept that idea, where you just like share everything, and there shouldn't be like rich people controlling things. That's sort of what John Wycliffe suggested in a sense. And surprisingly, there was some rich people who agreed with him. But they were in the minority, and in the end, Wycliffe just basically had to agree to retire into the countryside and not bother anyone. And the Peasants' Revolt wasn't a revolution, it was suppressed. And the 14th century ended, and going into the 15th century, like I said, because of all these, the social mobility and the lack of, there's holes in the chain of being, in the hierarchy. People are able to raise themselves out of the peasantry. The poor people are able sometimes to buy land or control land or move to a place and make more money or improve their situation to a degree that it was never possible. So going into the 15th century is kind of called the golden age of labor in English history, because there just wasn't enough people to work. So like I said, they got more money, and they were able to get opportunities. And by the time we start talking about Shakespeare, 200 years later, it's going to be the opposite. There's going to be too many people around again, which is what was going on, before the Black Death and before the famine. Okay, so these are significant dates, but again, you don't have to remember the numbers. Okay, just remember the Black Death happens, and then Chaucer and Wycliffe grow up. I'm not asking you to know when they're born. Just know that they were growing up. Okay, I think Wycliffe is a little bit older than Chaucer. I didn't even check that. I should have, but Chaucer, I think, was born about 1348. So he's literally a baby when the Black Death comes. Wycliffe is maybe like a kindergarten or something when that comes around. So they grow up, and like they are maturing during the Peasants' Revolt. They'll be like, they'll be old age technically, I guess. They'll be about 40 years old, or 30 to 40 years old, which would be a fairly middle-aged to old man. I'm 42, but I would probably not be alive if I lived in the 14th century. 42 is getting on. When you're in the 14th century, basically the life expectancy won't change for hundreds of years. So, 42-year-olds were not that as common as they are now. They're like the normal now. 1453, the biggest event that happens is that the Islamic armies in the Ottoman Turks specifically, they finally take Constantinople after hundreds of years of trying, and they destroy the final, leftover parts of Rome, which is the capital city is Constantinople, but you will know it now as Istanbul. And they just continue to expand for several hundred years after that. So that story is not over, but that's not really close to what's going on in England. They don't know that this has happened, even when the 100 Years' War. This is supposed to be, it's not 1 year. Embarrassingly, that's been there the whole time. But for some reason, I put 1 year there earlier. 100 Years' War, which is the opposite of 1 year almost. It's 115 years, technically. But France wins that war. And when France wins that war, England becomes an island suddenly, where it was sort of an empire before. And then England sort of dissolves into because of that, the defeat is a huge event, and the War of the Roses breaks out in 1455, which you don't need to know, but it ends in 1487. And these two dates, because the War of the Roses ending means that a single king gets control of the entire country. And that person is Henry VII. And that will change everything. So there's kind of, for England, other countries may start the early modern period at different dates. But for England, it's either 1453, when France defeats them, or 1487. If you're talking about European Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance starts about 100 years earlier. You're definitely talking about like 1381, the Peasants' Revolt starts in England, and the Italian Renaissance is beginning, for sure, by that point. It's like during the Black Death, the Italian Renaissance happens sort of simultaneously. It almost gets sort of accelerated by it. So this marks the next stage of history, and it's obviously a big cultural change too. But you have to remember, nobody knew. Nobody talks like that. Even right now, we're in the middle of a huge cultural change. AI and other things. COVID happened. There's war in different countries. Technology is changing. Globalization is changing. Your other professors will talk to you about this. I can't talk about everything, but basically we're in a big moment of cultural change. But you probably don't feel like that, and I don't either. But probably in the future, people will look back, just like they do towards the 15th century or the 16th century is where I think for England, 16th century is the most important period. That period is going to be the most influential on the future British culture until now. I don't think there's another period of British culture that's more significant. For America, it's totally different, but we'll talk about that later. So I'll see you on Friday, and thank you for listening. I hope this helps you prepare for the quiz. Focus on what's on the board. I'm just explaining in detail about the main points that I want you to understand, and we'll go over things again in class, as we always do. Thank you, and have a good night. See you on Friday.